Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 5th InnovationAus Budget Insider. My name is Corrie McLeod, and I am the publisher of InnovationAus.com. We are coming to you from Canberra, Brisbane, and Sydney today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country where I am, Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to their elders past, present, and future. Today, I'd like to start off by introducing James Riley and Denham Sadler, who have been down in budget lockup, combing through the budget papers specifically as it regards to the industry policy and innovation, who are going to give us a recap of what they found and set the scene for a broader conversation with our panellists that I'll introduce following their introduction. James and Denham, welcome. And what did you find? What were the big ticket items, and was there a lot in this budget for us?
Denham's going to kick off this morning. He's going to give a quick overview, and then I'll join in just after him.
Yeah, so there was quite a lot in there for us. It was an interesting one that the digital economy and digital services was a major part of the budget, and kind of the Treasurer did mention that in his speech. But one of the big package was that $1.2 billion that was announced last week. So we already kind of knew about that. So a lot of yesterday was kind of combing through that and finding out the detail. And a big chunk of that, $500 million of that, is going to MyGov and My Health Record. So they're kind of saying it's for enhancements to that. And there's lots of questions of whether that is going to go straight to consultants, like what's happened with MyGov, or where that money's actually going to be going. But there's a lot of stuff in there. And then a big chunk of that too was for artificial intelligence. So there's going to be a national centre established at CSIRO, and there's more funding for grants and research in there as well. In terms of new stuff, I think one that was really interesting for us was the patent box that got announced. So it is pretty limited, like it's just for medical and biotechnology patents. So it's pretty limited. I'm sure a lot in the sector would hope it would be a bit more wide ranging, but that's going to give tax breaks to kind of any income that's derived from that IP in Australia, and it's kind of a big effort to keep commercialization here. And then that's ended to clean energy, so there is an openness to open up to other sectors, so maybe it could go a bit more widely later on as well. In terms of reviews, for the first time in a while, the research and development tax incentive wasn't really mentioned in there. The only real change we saw was that the Board of Taxation is launching a review into the administration of the scheme, and that's going to kick off by the end of the year, or hopefully finish by the end of the year, I think. And there's going to be a review into the tax treatment of venture capital and the incentives on offer there as well. And another big one, it did come out on the morning, which was a bit annoying, but there's going to be some changes to employee share schemes as well. And that's kind of an interesting one that the government did announce some plan changes to that in 2018 that never ended up happening, but these ones do go a bit further, and a lot of startups are probably a bit more happy with them. But there's some changes to do with employees won't be forced to be taxed on them as soon as they finish up at the company that issued them, and the cap's been raised by quite a lot as well. James will probably talk a bit more to this, but there was some small initiatives to try and improve procurement for SMEs, which is always interesting for us. There was $2.6 million over 4 years for kind of a review, some pilot programs, some learning packages for companies, but nothing too huge in there. There's also a pretty big chunk of funding for a new program called Boosting the Next Generation of Women in STEM. So that was a bit more than $40 million for a scholarship program, and that's going to be in partnership with the private sector. And the E-Safety Commissioner got a big chunk of funding to assist with these new powers that are going to be probably debated in Parliament today, actually. And the Space Agency got a new funding boost, which is a big one for us. The space sector is kind of doing a lot of interesting stuff, and we write about it a lot. And they have got a lot more funding to kind of help them with issuing permits and applications for local launches. They actually haven't issued any yet, so that's a big concern in the sector, and with politicians, the funding boost will help them out with that. And on the vaccine front, it was a bit of an interesting one because they didn't actually say how much funding went to it, but they did kind of confirm plans for local mRNA vaccine capability and talking to the private sector to do that in the long term, but they said that was commercial in confidence, so there's no proper idea of actually how much money is going to be going towards that. And probably the other big one was they are going to finally split up the privacy commissioner. So at the moment, the same person is doing handling privacy and freedom of information stuff, but they are going to appoint an FOI commissioner, which ideally frees up a bit more time to handle privacy and data stuff as well, and to address a big backlog in FOI cases. But I think James is going to jump on now and talk a bit more detail of some of the stuff we found in the digital package.
Yeah, interesting budget. As Denham mentioned, there was a fairly big section within the Treasurer's speech devoted to some of the technology initiatives that had been announced in the previous week. I mean, it doesn't sound like a lot, but we've been at these events before, right, where there's been maybe a line or maybe absolutely nothing. So, I mean, if you call that progress, then that's progress. $1.2 billion for a digital economic strategy that didn't really read like a strategy. You wouldn't call it a grab bag, but they did seem just to package up a bunch of spending initiatives under that heading. When Scott Morrison announced the program or announced the initiative, I was expecting to see an actual strategy with some outlines of, KPIs and roadmaps and all the sorts of things you do in a strategy. That didn't eventuate. The biggest funding initiatives within that package was around $500 million for MyGov and MyHealth. Now, government is obviously a hugely important driver of behaviour, but as well as capability in a digital economy. So, having those big government platforms interacting with the public in a digital fashion is incredibly important. But by the same token, it's kind of run a business, and I would say slightly disingenuous to package it up as a new initiative. DTA, for all the focus on this, on digital and the digital economy, the Digital Transformation Agency, the whole of government digital agency, actually had a funding cut by about $90 million next financial year, and a fairly significant, about 10% cut in staff. You wouldn't read too much into that, given that some of the bigger projects that have been working on have been taken over by the agencies that they're in. So MyGov and MyGov, is in Services Australia, and Health's doing MyHealth. So beyond that, I guess what was not in the budget, as Denham mentioned, there was no mention, so to speak, of the R&D tax incentive. This, despite that having some sort of special case treatment for software, was the number one issue on the wish list of the startup sector. Also, no mention of a research translation fund. I think that was the number one priority on the wish list of the science community. I'll be very interested to hear what the panel has to say on the artificial intelligence stuff. Just before I hand off, look, my particular interest or bugbear is in how do you get more Australian companies involved in supplying services to government, like using procurement as an industry development lever. And there's not, frankly, a lot of action there. There's very little in the budget that would make you think any of those big spending items on the government procurement plans will go anywhere other than where it has been going, which is to large foreign suppliers. Obviously, large foreign suppliers are hugely important, but I would say we could make a lot better effort at using our procurement dollars to drive, industrial capacity and capability. Just finally, there's a business research innovation initiative, a very small program that was run out of the Department of Industry. It kind of creates challenges for specific problems. That BRI is based on a US program which is hugely successful, the Small Business Innovation Research Initiative, SBIR. So the Australian system, so low profile, you've never heard of it. It was announced with great promise by Malcolm Turnbull's National Innovation Science Agenda. That's being wound down. One final thing, another of the biggest spending items in the industry development arena was the industry growth centres. Those growth centres, things like Oz Cyber and the METS, Mining Engineering Technology Services. There's one in health. They are defunded, or their funding comes to an end at the end of next year. But over the forward estimates, it seems like there's still a very big pot of cash that's available in that area. They're not saying that those growth centres will continue, but they're not saying they're not either, simply that there is money in that area has been allocated. So I'm going to step back.
Thank you, James and Denham. Much appreciated, and a very useful summary for everyone who's trying to comb through all the news out of yesterday. There's certainly a lot to get through. I'd like to introduce our panel now, starting with Sarah Pearson, who's a non-executive director, investment director and advisor with leadership roles across lots of different areas, including space, deep tech, venture capital, etc. Prior to your roles, multiple roles, you were the inaugural Chief Innovation Officer and Chief Scientist at DFAT, and I think a scientist by training yourself. Welcome, Dr. Pearson.
Thanks, Corrie.
Matt Barrie is the CEO of Freelancer.com, and he's also the CEO of Escrow.com, a world leader in secure online payments, and adjunct professor in electrical and information engineering at the University of Sydney, and the co-author of over 20 US patent applications. Welcome back, Matt Barrie.
Yep.
Nick Therkelsen-Terry, welcome. You're the CEO and co-founder of Max Kelsen, a leading artificial intelligence and machine learning solutions company, and really the sort of company that a lot of the discussion today will centre around. Australian software company, global ambitions. We're really keen to hear from you about what these things mean for someone who's building the sort of company that you are. So can I just start with all of the panellists' initial reactions? What did you love? What did you think was missing or think was probably not the right approach? Dr. Pearson, can I start with you?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. I'd like to start with, obviously, it's a challenging time to doing any sort of a budget. You know, we have got no clue what's happening around the world, where economies are going to land. So I think to put that overarching big picture piece in there is really important. I think it's interesting to look at what other countries are doing. So some countries are actually using this as an opportunity to really accelerate their growth of new economies, and that's really exciting to see that. In terms of this budget, I think it's started to address some of that. It's got a few good programs. Something I would love to have seen, though, is much more of an overarching strategy and much more of an ambition and a vision for where we're taking our economy. There are lots of really good programs, for instance, around infrastructure, around aged care, around women, but they're all very much stuck in the old economy, not the new economy. So there's an opportunity. How do we use that money that they've put aside for these, what I think of as old economy pieces, to make sure that we're actually using that money to develop the new economies as well? Aged care, for instance. There's no way we're going to be able to deliver aged care to our growing age population with the current technologies, the current ways of doing things. So how do we draw in the new technologies? I would love to see a lot more of that. The digital strategy, yeah, you've talked about that. It's got some really good bits in it. I like the skills piece, the skills where they're talking about actually having you're working in industry and learning about these skills in industry. I think that's really important rather than just going to someone and learning these skills. It was really good to see the talk about venture capital, investing in emerging technologies. I want to know how that links with Main Sequence Ventures, though. So that's a deep tech investment company, has that link. The patent box, I think, is a really good idea. Hydrogen hubs and things they're going to do there are really good. The venture capital for ARENA is a pittance, though. It's just a tiny amount of money over a few years. So that's a shame. There are opportunities to align the investment in Northern Australia. Again, there's always opportunities to align current programs that you might not think of as having tech and science in them, but that's an opportunity. Missing women's engagement. Okay, so there's money for scholarships, but that's not where the problem is. If we're serious, listen to Kathy Foley. I think she said it's going to take 150 years to get equality in women in leadership in STEM. Giving a few scholarships isn't going to do it. I really want to see us do something really serious in this, because otherwise 51% of our population is going to miss out on these new economies as we are now. So I think that's a big thing. We've just really got to do something incredibly ambitious in it. Unis, they're absolutely in dire straits. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but it's a bad time for them. I didn't see a lot for universities in there. Collaboration. We need a lot more around collaboration. Interesting, great, there's money going into the AI hub, but we've got AI hubs around the place already. Let's make absolutely sure, Nick will talk about that, I'm sure, let's make absolutely sure we're linking in with all of that. It's not just something that Saro or Data 61 do. No mention of NISA. I didn't see anything about that. That's our sort of flagship for innovation strategy. Didn't see anything about that. Good to see that Department of Industry doing a bit around procurement. That's fantastic. What about defence? Bucket loads of money going into defence. Let's get some procurement targets, because defence cannot, a few of us were Trusted Autonomous System Defence CRC meeting symposium of the week. The future of defence is not the current defence. It's incredibly different. So again, how do you get local research, development, and startups into all of that? I probably talked for enough there, but I think there's a lot of good things, a lot of really good programs. So well done to the public service. But I think there's still a lot more we could do, and I'd love to see it a lot more ambitious and visionary.
Thank you, Sarah. Nick, I could see you nodding with vigorous agreement to things that were said there. Software, you're a local software producer. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna agree a lot with what Sarah had to say, which isn't new, and with what James had to say. Look, this is obviously the most significant budget for the technology sector in quite a while, and we have to call that out and give credit to that. The last couple haven't delivered a lot to the sector, and so it is good to see a lot of the things that we've been asking for, in some way land in this budget. But it does lack that overall strategy and that ambition that Sarah talks about. I think it could have been a lot more ambitious and a lot more cohesive as a strategy. But if we think about the individual, and there's a lot of individual initiatives contained within the budget, as James said, not quite a grab bag, but lots of very small different initiatives. I think that, and we'll dive deeper into this, but the AI piece talks a lot about adopting technologies, not building technologies. That makes me very concerned. AI, machine learning, is one of the most transformative technologies we're going to see in a long time, and Australia can't be just buying it. We need to be building and exporting it. So that's sort of, I think, a missed opportunity there. A number of the initiatives, quicker depreciation, the patent box, are about companies. They're going to benefit companies that are post-revenue, in fact, profitable. So they're not necessarily geared towards the startup or even scale-up sector that is either pre-revenue or pre-profit. So again, I think we're not quite landing on necessarily where the support is needed or being asked for, as something like the RDTI changes would have delivered. I actually think, to zoom out, one of the biggest things missing from this budget, although there are important notes about skills, particularly 460 advanced scholarships, which is to be encouraged and good to hear, particularly in the deep tech sectors. But there is built into the budget an assumption of reducing net migration, and we're already seeing real upward pressure on wages in the sector from the lack of net migration over the last 12 months. There doesn't seem to be a fix to that, or any ambition, at least for the next couple of years, to resolve that. And I would make the observation that we can train as many people as we want, but if we actually don't have the experienced talent in our sector to help nurture those people coming through, then we're not going to get them to the level that they need to be for us to be a global competitor. So I think that's the skills. Whilst there is some interesting pieces in the budget for skills, it doesn't go nearly far enough to resolving some of the shortages that the sector has today, let alone what the sector is going to have over the next couple of years. So I think I'll stop there. There's tons to talk about here, and I'm keen to dive into some of the detail.
Thanks, Nick. Matt, Barrie, you have been a commentator with us on previous budgets. Last year, there probably wasn't a whole lot. What does this budget look like, and what are your initial reactions to it?
Thank you for having me. I think it's built on a remarkable number of assumptions and wishful thinking that needs to continue. The budget assumes that the GDP will, basically recover. The economy will basically recover now in the next few months. That the time for unemployment to kind of bounce back to pre-COVID levels is just 2 years as of next year. COVID's over, everything's back to normal, and it's all great. Now, at the same time, it's also relying on the fact that borders will be open, everyone will be vaccinated by the end of the year, and so forth. Now, a couple of things, these things might hold. I mean, with the borders closed, anecdotally, I'm seeing a lot of retail operators desperately needing people. They're saying they can't find people. JobKeeper's only come off 6 weeks ago. Maybe some of the people are sitting on their bums trading Dogecoin and getting away from JobKeeper might decide they want to go pick some peas or get back into hospitality. But we'll see about that. But I mean, overall, it makes so many assumptions that everything's back to normal. Vaccine strategy works, which I think it's very doubtful that it will work. all eyes are on Israel right now, which have pretty much vaccinated their population, and cases are way down, and deaths are way down. But the problem is that, according to all the research I've read, that you're just as likely to catch the virus with the vaccine. The vaccines are in production as without. Just you don't get very sick. But the question is down to transmissibility and can you still transmit? And all the reading I've done shows that you can still transmit, and the virus is mutating, and some of these new variants have the vaccines have very low efficacy against them. In fact, in South Africa, they stopped rolling out the AstraZeneca because it was basically useless against even moderate cases. So the big question is, if Israel opens its borders back up again and some of these new variants come in, variants of concern, that whether or not it will take off again, and then we'll have another panic and have to shut down and come up with another vaccine. And then how many of these mRNA vaccines can you have producing all sorts of random proteins in your body before you might have some side effects? So it's still very, very early days, and they say in the budget that COVID is 30 times worse than the GFC. Well, there's nothing here in the budget that indicates to me that it is 30 times worse at all. It looks like a little speed hump. So it makes the assumption that all that goes to plan. The vaccine strategy works when you call open borders, which I just don't think is going to happen. I think what will happen is we'll see a scare in Israel, or somewhere like that, which is a bit of a test tube for the vaccine strategy, and then people will realize there's a problem. I mean, already we're seeing a lot of cases where vaccinated security guards in hotel quarantine are leading to breaches, taking it home, giving it to their wives, or whatever it may be in Australia. 1 in every 106 cases that we bring into the country into hotel quarantine results in a breach, and at the moment we're bringing about 180 people a fortnight in, so we're going to get a breach a week, and we're seeing that. There's a breach yesterday in Victoria, there's a breach in Sydney, where with these new variants, they don't know how it's actually breaching the hotel. They're having a hard time. Well, genetically they can link it up with PCR testing. They're not sure exactly how it got out of the various hotels and into the people who are running around with it. So relies upon all of that. Also relies upon continued windfall exports. I mean, if you're not trading Dogecoin, you can trade lumber and iron ore and soybeans and corn and hogs and just any copper, gold and silver about to take off in a big way. I mean, you can trade any commodity and they're going up, right, in a big way. And we've had a big windfall. I mean, what's kind of saved the budget in a big way is iron ore, which is up triple in the last 2 years, depending which contract you look at. It's delivering absolutely ridiculous windfall profits. Now, it's the big question is this big reflation trade because of the infrastructure spending the US and China are doing, et cetera, to pump their economies, or are there a bunch of speculators jumping in the middle of this and front running? And I think there might be a lot of speculators front running. In fact, on FinTwit, which I'm a pretty avid reader of, there's a few commenters saying now, actually, I think like these runs are actually way overblown, and this is more speculation than actual reflection of real supply and demand. But Australia is a massive beneficiary of these really, really high commodity prices. Iron ore, number one export in particular. I mean, coal's okay, but there's been a bit of a trade war with China over that, and to a lesser extent, all these other bits and pieces that we produce, we've had to find alternative markets because everything from barley to lobsters to you name it, China's been coming up with plausible reasons why they don't want to import. There may be a labeling problem or pests or some other issue like that. Although we've been fairly successful in finding other markets. In fact, exports have been pretty good overall in terms of finding other markets. But this whole strategy does rely upon Australia continuing to generate windfall profits from its exports, from its commodities. And again, there's not a lot in the budget around elaborate transforming those commodities into manufactured goods at a high level, although there's some good stuff about trades and so forth. So there's that. It also relies upon geopolitical stability. And I do want to call this out because some countries are in major crisis. You obviously look at India, where I think they've actually probably reached their limit of testing at the moment with 400,000 cases a day and 4,000 deaths. I think they've kind of hitting I think the numbers I've been reading online, they think it's 10 times larger than that. I've certainly been trying to bring someone out from India to join my company. He says, the positivity rate in places like Delhi are well over 33%. Everyone's got it, and so there's inability to test at this point, and people don't want to go and get tested because they might catch it if they're what have you. But you've got issues with that, and will that in emerging markets lead to refugees and other border issues? Then you have the whole China question. There's been a lot of saber rattling there. We're certainly entering a cold war with China. China has a lot of punitive things it's doing to punish Australia. It's kind of hamstrung a little bit on iron ore. And I don't know what the freight differential is with Brazil, but China is stockpiling commodities left a hand over fist. But then at the same time, they've got border disputes with 21 countries at the moment. There's been the stuff that's happened only in the last couple of days. China apparently appears to warn India in the New York Times, pushed too hard and the lights could go out because the electricity grid in Mumbai was turned black, and they turned up the power in Mumbai with a hacking attack. Then the US, I don't know if you've been following the Colonial Pipeline system, that was turned off due to a cybersecurity. They call it a ransomware attack, but it turns out that another article in New York Times said the actual hackers that did it have actually posted an apology saying, we're apolitical, we do not participate in geopolitics, our goal is to make money, not create problems to society. From day on, we'll introduce moderation and check each company that our partners want to encrypt to avoid social. So basically, we'll be careful in future who we hack for, because it looks like we hack for China, right? And so
I wanted to jump in there because everything you put up are things that are kind of related to the budget: critical infrastructure protection, cybersecurity, defence, sovereign capability, our continued dependence on commodities in export markets. So I just wanted, because that context that you've given, and then this budget can't be decoupled from a global environment that we live in. I wanted to kind of bring back to the panel. Sarah, you mentioned earlier the National Innovation Science Agenda, which was obviously a big vision on what was going to turn this around, that we weren't so dependent on all that commodity export that you've spoken about. Now, we didn't hear much about it. We know that there were lots of learnings from the NISA, lots of things that went really well, lots that didn't go so well, and lots that were kind of middling. So in all of the digital strategy and all of the measures in the budget, how well have we been able to articulate the vision of what that next phase looks like? Even talking about the patent box that relies just on medtech and energy, why doesn't it marry up with other focus areas? So back to the panel, just to kind of map some of those announcements into those big picture things that Matt talked about.
Yep, thanks, Corrie. Matt, thank you so much for that big picture. You're absolutely right. I guess that was a bit I was saying at the beginning. It's also uncertain. How do you deliver a strategy in such uncertain times? But you obviously have to make sure you've got those in the back of your mind. And a key part of that is, as you're saying, Corrie, making sure that you're ready, because who knows what will happen with global markets, global economies, who we'll be selling to. But what we know we'll have to do is we'll have to be saying things with new science and new technology. That's where the high growth is, and that's what we need to be involved in. If we want to be affordable, then we're also going to have to make sure our manufacturing's got the high tech. If you want to be safe and secure, we want to make sure we've got the biosecurity as well as obviously the cybersecurity. So there's absolutely no shadow of doubt that we need to be pushing this agenda. In this budget, like I said at the beginning, there's lots of great programs, but I don't see it all hanging together with a big vision that fits into Matt's description of the geopolitical, geoeconomic, etc. situation we find ourselves in, and the talent that we have in Australia, because that's the university piece that has, I think, that's been missed out in this budget. How do we use that talent to overcome some of these challenges? Because we've got really smart people in universities who are ready to help us build new industries, who are ready to help us solve social as well as the economic challenges, and we're not reaching into that in this budget from my perspective. So I think that's a missing piece. And Nick, you talked about the talent gaps that we've got here. Yeah, I mean, migration's a massive issue. If I think about, with my main Sequence Ventures hat on, the sorts of talent that we need to scale up the early stage ideas that we invest in, it's just we don't have enough of it here. The experienced talent, that really, I mean, we've got some visas in this budget, but we need more than that. Sorry, Matt, you're going to jump in.
I'll just comment on that briefly. I think they're starting to improve their immigration programs. Before, we were bringing in hundreds of thousands of people basically to prop up the housing market. We'll bring in cooks to work in suburban, curry houses and kennel herders and all sorts of random, even bringing in migration agents. But now they've got a thing like called the Global Significant Talent Visa, and that's actually pretty good. They've targeted specific areas like AI, ICT, biotech, fintech, etc. I have a candidate that was in India, and he just said, "Listen, I've never been to Australia, but he set up the National Cybersecurity Centre for India. He goes, I just applied for this visa in 30 days. I got permanent residency." I mean, they're the sorts of people. They're the sorts of people we need to be bringing in, not people to prop up the housing market. And I think they should do more on that. In fact, I actually think at this point in time, Australia is one of the most attractive places in the world.
Exactly.
So if you want to bring in people who are not meeting the criteria, they should just have a visa, which is $1 million. You pay the government a $1 million fee, and you can come in. You'd have 1 million people lined up to try and get in. I guarantee you.
Yeah, something like that at one point, the significant investor visa. Not sure that we've heard a lot about that recently. Nick, you wanted to add to that?
Well, yeah, the government did improve the significant, well, not the investor visa, the global talent visa quite considerably a year or two ago, where originally it didn't have a path to citizenship, which may undermine its value, I think, but they did resolve that. And it now is a very good, I agree with Matt, it's a very good policy instrument we have to bring in talent. Problem at the moment is actually then getting that talent to Australia. You can get a visa granted for them, but if Matt, I'm interested to see how you go getting that talent from India, particularly at the moment, but we've been trying to bring someone from China for 5 months. Getting flights is extremely difficult.
I think the story is completely overblown. I've brought people in from the Philippines, no problem. You just got to go out a week or two, and you got to pay a bit extra, and maybe you got to rate your plane through somewhere. But I think it's completely overblown. A lot of people complaining they can't get back. Maybe you got a family of 5 and you want all the family of 5 on the same plane. You got some scheduling issues, and certainly if you're in India, you got a problem, right? But outside of that, I think if you really want to come back and you had to pay a bit extra and go through a bit of complications, but you can get back.
I guess that's highlighting, there's stuff there, but how do we make sure people know about it and that we're using it strategically? Which brings me to another point, which is it's not just about money. I know this is a budget, and so we talk about money, but what is government's role in this? It's not just money. I think government's roles in building these new economies is changing. I think we need to help governments move beyond just the handing out the grants and being the grant givers, and people who can help work collaboratively in the ecosystem, help people collaborate, make things easier for people, be the grease in the wheels to make things happen faster, focus on how you connect the ecosystems and the opportunities. And I think that's and procurement obviously is a big part of that. There are things that government can do beyond this budget, which are not involving large sums of money. And I'd love to see government thinking about how they do that. I mean, for instance, it's more than a visa. How do you then make sure people have somewhere to live, they feel they're part of the community, and there's a whole system that draws them into those ecosystems?
If if you bring them in because they're highly skilled, they go and get a great job, and it's a high-paying job, right? The problem is we bring in students that can't afford to live. When I went to California, USA for my master's program, I had to show proof of funds so I could actually survive. And what we're doing is we're bringing in Deliveroo drivers who are skirting through the immigration system to try and get a visa, who are unskilled for the most part, right? I mean, that's the issue. I do want to bring up one more point just to finish off my original narrative. I mean, so you got the geopolitical stability issue, and you may note that there's been a lot of, last week there was a day where 3 of the 6 top articles in Fairfax was about going to war with China. They brought out some general who started talking about this, and that was deliberate. And then you've got the editor of the Global Economic Times in China, who is the propaganda mouthpiece for the Chinese government, who's just published an article literally this week saying China needs to make a plan to deter extreme forces of Australia, where they've said, I quote, the plan should include long-range strikes on the military facilities and relevant key facilities in Australia, if it's really going to send its troops to China's offshore areas and combat against the PLA. I think it's a good chance that Taiwan will get taken this year. I mean, Hong Kong was pretty much taken, and I think at the same time you've got the massive buildup of Russian troops in the Ukraine border. They'll probably go and take a bit of Ukraine at the same time, and there'd be a big question, if Biden goes to war with Taiwan, will Australia follow? And the one last point I want to make on the picture is that all of this budget also assumes that there will be no input cost issues. Australia can't be a big beneficiary of all these commodity exports without having big input cost issues into its own businesses, right? If you actually want to do anything with these commodities, if you want to build a house, you need lumber, right? If you put out infrastructure, you need copper, and these things are all climbing massively. And I don't think that's been fully understood. I think there's a lot of wishful thinking that this is all over. In actual fact, I think it's only just begun. I think we're going to see some real structural issues happen globally. I'm very surprised I haven't seen banks fail. If people are not paying their rent, it falls back onto the landlord, it falls onto the banks, and then you have a debt crisis. And I think you're going to have a massive crisis there. At the moment, it's being papered over by extreme money printing. At the end of the day, the Australian government's going to end up with a net debt of $1 trillion, and we're going to have to print money to the extreme just like everyone else. So I think it's fanciful to think this is all over. However, if you believe that story, the budget's actually surprisingly well thought out. They're not building car parks for marginal electorates to try and tip them over the edge in this one. There is a bit of stuff to box Labor in. I think Labor's going to have a really tough time responding to this because there's a bit for women, there's a bit for climate, there's a bit for whatever, there's a bit for AI. It's kind of, and what do you do? Propose you to spend more. So I think they've boxed them in with this. So it is a bit of an election budget, but I actually was surprisingly pleased to see that they're thinking about bits and pieces here or there to kind of to improve the economy. But you have to believe a lot of fairy tale assumptions.
Matt, I'll rewind 12 months, and I think sort of the timelines that you were talking about were vastly different to some people talking in terms of the impact of the coronavirus being sort of July, August timeframe. I think even then you were talking years out. So, and that's certainly proven to be true. So just going back to James and Denham, when we talk about the big picture stuff that Matt's outlined, and if the assumptions are that we're all back on track and we've got a roadmap to recovery that's kind of coherent and makes sense, does the budget, the narrative in the budget, really address those things? It does seem that there's some patches, that there is lots for everyone, but just in the context of Matt's comments, what are your thoughts? And you're on mute, James, before you start talking.
Again. Yeah, look, Matt, they were incredibly interesting comments. And how does this budget kind of map to those, your questions of those assumptions? I don't think it does. Like, we were in conversation last night with a bunch of people who'd come out of budget events, so everyone was kind of talking talking the issue of the day. I don't think anyone said the borders would be open before 2023, 2024 in any meaningful way. So, I mean, there seems to be an assumption, anecdotally, people don't believe that borders are going to be open, certainly not in the way we would travel pre-pandemic. And so it was surprising that we didn't see more attention given to that skills front. I think Nick makes a very good point about access to experienced talent. Like, we've got great people in Australia. We've got a system that churns out good people, but there are areas where we don't have the kind of deep skills in particular things. Like, even building big, fast-growing companies is something that you require specific experience in, and we haven't done that at the kind of scale that other countries have done. So, yeah, to Matt's point on the assumption that borders will be open, I don't think that's an assumption you can make and rely on.
I think the biggest thing that's missing from this is money to build a proper federal quarantine centre. I think that is the premise that makes this all work. If we're having a breach every 106 cases being brought in, and the cases are still growing around the world, in some places exponentially, particularly from the markets we tend to bring people in from, you've got to have really good quarantine. You can't just, what are you going to do? Vaccinate 70% of the population, give the population a deadline, say, hey, we're opening borders next week, and then all of a sudden you bring someone in, someone catches it, the whole thing runs through, and then instead of having a 2% effect on GDP growth like we've got now, it's 10% like it is in the UK, because you have this massive outbreak and a massive lockdown, right? It's fanciful to think that you're just going to vaccinate everyone, open the borders. So I think they really need to allocate a lot of money for a federal quarantine response.
I agree.
I think, make this work.
Sorry, you go.
Oh, look, I was just going to say, one of the things that probably didn't get reflected particularly well in the media coverage that I saw today, but Josh Frydenberg's press conference inside lockup yesterday, he was really hammered on that specific question. Where's the money for quarantine? Is it squirreled away somewhere and it's going to get dropped? Because there were initiatives like that mRNA, this commitment to building local production of mRNA vaccines, where they just simply didn't say how much they had allocated. So
that's what the patent box is. The patent box is purely for vaccine development in Australia. It's not for biotech startups in Australia. It's because you won't have significant tax revenue, right? It takes you years to do research. That's purely to get vaccine manufacturing happen.
Okay. Oh, well, that makes sense. But anyway, they were hammering him on this idea, the quarantine facility. Where's the money? And it doesn't appear to be budgeted at this point.
Sorry, Matt. Just on that point, it requires the IP to be held in Australia.
Exactly.
For that patent box to work. So that would only benefit UQ.
No, it would also benefit overseas countries that want to go and patent in Australia the intellectual property, right? And I think
it would require
bring research in Australia was in a really funny situation in COVID because the bushfires had happened. We had no masks stockpiled. The national medical stockpiles, which I kind of helped out in the peak of the crisis. Didn't stockpile things that were useful for COVID, like face shields and so forth. And then people tried bringing it. All these entrepreneurs were bringing it in. I was bringing it in, right? Bringing in masks, bringing in what have you. And then you had a lot of grandstanding by Homeland Security going, "Oh, these masks they're made in China. They're not the Australian standard." Well, you've built the Australian standard just to boost domestic production. These masks actually work, right? There's some poor quality stuff, but the good stuff actually works. And entrepreneurs were selling on eBay. People were bringing in all this equipment to protect Australia. And then Peter Dutton started grandstanding around saying, "Oh, we're going to stop it at border security and confiscate it." So started confiscating all this PPE that was coming in. And then what happened is, after the developers, Greenland and what have you, were buying all this stuff up in shops and sending it back to China, which is ironically what the Australian entrepreneurs were doing in China, was buying it all up in Chinese shops and bringing it into the country. Dutton went and banned the export of PPE from Australia when 95% of it was produced in China. So all Greenland were doing were re-exporting the stuff that was made in China, brought to Australia, and Australian shops sold it at a profit and sent it back. And at that point, Australia was cut off from PPE. I was trying to bring it in, and I was saying we can't send any PPE to Australia. So we were in a bit of a crisis there, and now we've got a problem with the vaccines where, because we've had such a good response, that Europeans and what have you don't really give us vaccines because other more desperate nations. So we've got to build a domestic capability for this.
Can I just go to some of the questions, and I'd like to invite more questions from people watching today. One of the questions is, with the DTA resources cut, how surprising is that, given the renewed focus on the digital economy, and the agency's move back to the PM&C? And I'd kind of frame that as well, saying the DTA's role has really seemed to have changed from its original, focus. Any thoughts from James and Denham particularly, and any of the other panellists? Nick?
Yeah, look, I think it probably reflects an evolution of the DTA's remit. That originally it was there to get the federal agencies adopting technologies and sort of as a way to pull them through. And as you mentioned, I think it was James mentioned, like a lot of those initiatives now have been pushed back to the departments because the departments have developed a more advanced digital capability. And so the DTA's role in that, somewhat, and I'm sure this is a point that people on the panel can debate, but in a sense, job done. We've had these initiatives that have been pushed back to the departments, and they are starting to drive that digital, transformation that the agency was meant to kickstart. And so the money now lands in the departments rather than landing in the DTA. But interested in others' views on whether it is job done.
Look, I'll jump in there. I mean, so the DTA was set up prior to Malcolm Turnbull becoming Prime Minister. So he was Communications Minister. It was a particular passion of his. I don't think it's within a bull's roar of being job done. I mean, to the extent that this kind of digital transformation is an ongoing process anyway. But to me, like a big part of it, a big part of the original DTO and now DTA was just to build internal capability and capacity inside the public service. Now, there's lots of structural issues that get in the way of them achieving that goal. But right now, when you've got what will be a massive program like the MyGov reimagining and redevelopment, that's gone through prototyping and a short beta and is about to launch into the kind of scale up version of that system. It's all been done externally by Deloitte. Like, maybe the thinking's been done internally, but it hasn't been used, despite what will be hundreds of millions of dollars being used to develop a crack team of digital ninjas who can do these systems. It's been an outsourced program, and that's got to be disappointing.
I'd agree with that, James. I think it goes back to that point I mentioned about public service reform, public sector reform, and I know there's lots of programs around that. Having an agency that's responsible is a great start, but it's never the end point. So, the fact that they're not investing as much in it would be fine, as long as they're doing more in terms of the rest of the public sector reform, which, you obviously don't see in the budget. It'd be great to see if some of the public servants take up some of those cadetships Because I know a few years back now, when it was NICTA, so Data 61 originally NICTA, they wanted to set up something like that, where they'd actually give public servants these cadetships where you could have them working in tech companies or have them learning whilst they're also public servants. So I'd like to see that they'll take up some of that through that. But that public service reform, and not just from a digital perspective, but also from, as I said earlier, what government's role is beyond just handing out money. I think that whole piece really needs to be done. Be good to see. Be good to see that.
I think the other good thing was that they didn't raise taxes like Biden is mooting to do. I mean, Biden's getting rid of, or proposing to get rid of the capital gains tax discount, which will most definitely bring the stock markets down. And mooting wealth taxes and trying to get the rest of the world to agree to a minimum corporate tax and whatever. And I think it's quite good they didn't go and touch those areas.
Sarah, can I go back? You said something earlier about, obviously, the women in STEM discussion is an ongoing one that bubbles away in the background, and it's certainly a discussion that we like to be part of. There's some fantastic work that's done in this country, but it doesn't seem to be shifting the needle. We've talked about the industry, our partnerships and scholarships, and that we need to be kind of bold and ambitious. How do we do that? How do we really kind of kickstart out of this kind of,
Yeah, well, it's one of those complex systems, isn't it? It's not just a silver bullet. There's a whole load of different things that need to change. And way back when I was suggesting that we should do the IDEO mapping, so let's get a girl born and let's look at her entire life and see who the influences are and how you affect all of those. For instance, primary school teachers, I shudder when I hear about primary school teachers that tell girls maths is for boys. I mean, that's disgraceful, and they're women teachers. And there's all these points along a girl's life that get impacted. There have been some great roadmaps, women in STEM roadmaps done, and I know that we've got our ambassador for women in STEM, which are all really great moves. But I think it's an opportunity to draw together a collaborative approach. So how do you make sure you've got industry working together with government, working together with the universities, working together? I think there's lots of little pieces, but it's not all together. There's a new program that's just about to launch called Unique You, which is actually working with high school girls who are thinking about STEM, but in non-traditional roles, not just in terms of going to university, but actually going through TAFE, so vocational education. And I think that's a big piece that's missed. How do we get girls in STEM in the vocational side of things? And they're actually matching women in those vocational jobs with the girls. So I think that's one step, that collaboration. But we actually just need the whole piece to work together, and for us to say this is not good enough. We really do. We're actually all going to jump in and change with this. So from a board's perspective, we're going to make sure that there are no ASX boards with less than, let's say, 40% women on them. That there should be none. So I know that's targets and everyone's debatable about that, but I think that bigger picture piece about bringing everyone together and saying, okay, this is a mission. We can't go to the moon right now, but let's have a mission in Australia, which is equality for women.
I'm interested to know what Matt Barrie thinks about that. You're running an ASX-listed company, Matt. What do you think about this idea of, having some sort of mandated targets for women on boards? And one other thing you might want to address also is it's been put to me by many people that government grants should be attached to similar kinds of targets. So if you're accessing an accelerating commercialisation grant, you might need a proportion of your team, a minimum proportion of your team being women. Matt, what do you think?
But I don't think anyone should be discriminated against by having quotas. I mean, I'm very negative on quotas. I think people should be there because they're good, right? And not because we say that they're, tall, short, fat, thin, have a certain gender, what have you. I don't think it should be a quota for anything. Now, on the other hand, I do fully encourage getting more women into technology and so forth. And we need to address K-12 in particular. I think it's the future of our country. And particularly by year 10, kids have made their mind up because we have this crazy leaderboard system called the HSC, or whatever they call it now, UAI, where you kind of get ranked and that determines what jobs you can do, etc. But, I don't think there should be a quota for anything. I think we should encourage, diversity of opinion and of thought and so forth. But I don't think that we should have quotas.
We've just got about 10 minutes left. We've got a few questions from the audience. One is, doesn't seem to be a lot on cybersecurity in the budget. Is that Is that right? Are we reading that right? Or it seems to be such an important discussion.
I thought there was a mention of a centre of excellence of some sort being funded. I did write it down. It was after AI. They mentioned cybersecurity. Plus, I will note that this new globally significant talent visa that they've got does specifically target cybersecurity, and they are actively granting it, because I am interviewing one of the guys who set up the National Cybersecurity Centre in India for that, and he got the visa in 30 days. He said, I applied on an off chance and I got permanent residency. His problem is now getting out because of the flights, but I think the flight's now going to Howard Springs and they're going to the quarantine facility there, so hopefully he'll get a flight soonish. But at least for skills, that's available, and it's happening. And I do think there's something in the budget about the centre there.
So there is money in the budget for cyber, just like there is for AI. And I'm trying not to be too negative, but is it enough? If you look at how much other countries are spending on AI, it's an absolute pittance. And the same around the cybersecurity. You know, if you think about the cybersecurity opportunities that Matt was talking about, the challenges Matt was talking about, is it enough? And are we really being serious about it? I think probably not as much as we need to be.
Well, more to your point, actually, if I could really enhance on that. I think we have a once-in-a-generational opportunity here to reskill the nation. If you think at a high level, if the borders are closed and will be closed for a longer period of time, this is a real chance to reskill the nation. And I think we could do a real Apollo program here, where you could provide real incentives in key areas in universities to get people into universities to study and retrain them, and as well as trade schools, world-class trade schools, the level of Germany, level of some parts of the US, etc., and really reskill the nation. Because after 3 or 4 years of going through those schools, and I think trade schools are a very important part of that, people come out, they get high-paying jobs and start businesses and do all sorts of crazy things. Now, there are some stuff in the budget around that, so I won't discount that. But I think we could really, really, really double down on that and just, okay, borders are closed. Let's make Australia not just a lucky country, but a smart country. Let's really build an Apollo program about re-education, and a lot of that comes from the high school system, which you've got to make it so that kids are excited about technology naturally, but they need to be able to connect the dots from that to actually what the career paths are and what subjects to study in school, which is missing. Yeah,
I'd absolutely agree with that, Matt. And I'm going to get back to this gender piece. Okay, if you don't like the quotas, I get that. I know that's an issue. It is actually a much more complex issue than just merit, though. So I need to have that say. If you don't want to do quotas, do a gender lens. We used to do that on all the programs that we invested in. Let's make sure we got the gender lens, so we're not making ourselves do the wrong thing because our brains think a certain way and think male, myself included.
Yeah, I've got many companies. Some of my companies have been an all-female team, and the reason why they've been an all-female team is because all of them are the best people in the job. They're all the best people in the job, right? Like, exactly. It's just I don't make any decisions based on who the candidates are, and I pick from the candidates available.
Yeah. So just back to that point about building the skills and making this a great mission, I'd absolutely agree, and making sure that we get rid of any sort of a skew that we have that stops women from being part of this. Because AI, if we don't have women in this, we are stuffed from an AI perspective. We need to be really careful on that.
We used to have a really solid AI program in Australia. I remember in 1991 to 1995 or 4, when I went through my computer science degree, we had Ross Quinlan, who wrote the textbook that I ended up using at Stanford when I did AI at Stanford. He was an American in Australia. You had Norman Fu. You had Australian AI researchers were on the global stage back then. In fact, many of the textbooks, Neil Westy in chip design, it was the textbook I used at Stanford. He was from Adelaide. You're
not wrong, but I think that we did much better in those symbolic systems days but we've been asleep at the wheel in the deep learning systems days, right? Yeah. The representation of Australian research at conferences like ICML or NeurIPS is woeful. We perform way down the end of the list, and we really have been asleep at the wheel. And, it's 2021. Deep learning AI has been in vogue since 2013, and we're just starting to put a focus on it. I think the next missed opportunity, the area that we actually have a structural advantage in research, is quantum computing. We do. We absolutely have world-class research here, and a lot of the research we've exported to the world. But again, we're looking at a budget that doesn't mention quantum computing. Is it going to be another 10 years until we have some quantum computing support in the budget, even though the time to do it would be now, given the current, the current advantages that we have? And I think Australia, if we zoom out, we continue to have this problem where we quite like the R side of R&D, the research, the universities, research centers, etc. And then, we're writing, depreciation for software, patent box, etc., which is really past the D side. It's in profit and scale. The gap still is in the development. It's in the translation. James mentioned earlier that there was no, translation fund which was being asked for. The RDTI is lacking. And again, we're in a situation where the funding gap, and if I look at the AI funding, it's about adoption, which is sort of conceding that we're too late, to actually be an innovator and builder of AI here in Australia and an exporter of it, because it doesn't mention any of those things. Are we going to do the same with quantum computing, where we were strong in the R and as a nation have invested deeply in research in quantum computing over the last 20 years? And are we going to miss the development and commercialization phase of that and end up adopting, quantum technologies in 2028, 2030 when they're actually commercially available?
I agree, Nick. And anyone who knows me knows I wheel out this wheelbarrow every time, which is I love what Innovate UK used to do, which is a strategic technology road mapping. You find an industry sector, you do your road mapping. Great. What are the technologies we've got? What are the export high growth opportunities? Now, how do we make the whole system, the triple helix, work to do the R and the D and the C?
And you could take one of these line items in the budget, chip off say $200 million, and offer 200 globally significant researchers $1 million each to come to Australia and enjoy COVID-free, beautiful air, water, land, right? Like food.
Yeah.
And bring a lot of expertise in. I don't think it'd be that expensive in the scheme of things.
Yeah.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, particularly on quantum, and we've had examples of this, over the decades. Matt, you were mentioning AI, but wouldn't it be great, although there are a lot of budget initiatives in tech, wouldn't it be great if government actually just placed a couple of big bets on new emerging techs where we are showing promise?
Yes, right from the R to the D and the C, so not even just the R.
Yeah, I mean, China gets up and goes. There are 9 strategically important areas we want to focus on in the future. The US has done the same. They've got actually the US has got 9 areas. They've a high performance ceramics, deep learning, supersonic engine technology, chip fabrication, and these are all structurally and strategically important areas where they're building the expertise, stopping the exports, et cetera, to really solidify them as for the future. I mean, China can make chips, but it can't make the machines that make the chips very well, for example.
Well, fabrication is an interesting point, Matt, in the context of the geopolitical environment that you elucidated before, and again, something that the sector has been talking about, some sovereign fabrication capability at a development phase, not research, as we have at University of Sydney. But again.
Well, it's critically important, because if Taiwan gets taken, where a lot of the chips get manufactured, where's it going to go? Right? It's either have to go back onshore, or there's maybe an opportunity for Australia to get into this. I mean, we had the expertise in the CSIRO in the past with some of the work at Dennis, what's his name was, Dennis Redfern, was it? Etc. We've got bits and pieces everywhere. We had Neil Westy with Radiata and David Skellen. We've had stuff in the past. If we concentrate on this, it could be a good opportunity for us.
Yeah, and we've got emerging expertise in it too, in terms of emerging chips.
Yeah, it's seismically stable country.
Well, the office of the chief scientist in New South Wales has put a report together on the fabrication sector and where Australia might be able to take advantage of some of the opportunities you've talked about. Hasn't really seen the light of day publicly, but it's available if anyone's interested in that fab sector.
Right. Corrie, do you mind if I make a quick comment, because we've got a bunch of public servants on the line? It'll be really, really quick. And I just want to say, at a time when dollars are short, it's hard to get governments to put money into anything other than a job today, shovel ready. I just want to congratulate them, because it must have been a hard fight to get this money. So I just want to say well done. I would encourage you to retrofit all those programs into some sort of strategic framework, so you can actually put it in some sort of strategy, including focusing on some of these opportunities. So the opportunities we've been talking about now, is there some way of retrofitting that into that? And also, innovators and entrepreneurs are just going to get on with it. So jump in. Don't just sit in your office and give out grants. Jump in, get involved with the innovators and entrepreneurs, and see if there's other ways you can help.
I was going to do a summary, but Dr. Pearson, I think you did that perfectly. So there's not a lot. There's lots of big picture opportunity. There's lots of opportunity to re-engineer some of those announcements into a strategy that can really help march things forward. And also just the note that everyone's made is there is an opportunity right now. We've seen some come and go. Let's not lose another one. I'd just like to thank James and Denham. It's obviously a massive day in budget lockup. Appreciate you providing the context and the overview. Matt, Barrie, your insights are always incredibly valuable, and putting it in the lens of all those things that are going on that make this budget important right now. Nick, you are ground zero of the sort of things we're talking about in terms of how do we keep companies like yours flourishing and growing for prosperity. Sarah Pearson, a brilliant lens. You see it through lots of different views, which was incredibly important to the conversation. So I'd like to thank you. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate. Have a fantastic day, and looking forward to seeing you all soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.